I'm not your gossip girl, I'm the headline. Truth with a curve, baby, redefine. Welcome to the thirst trap. All the truth looks good in a tight wrap. We talk love, power, so let's in. Turn the world on, let the light in. Yeah, the thirst trap news. You'll drink it up, it's the real you. Never try it, first bro news. Where every headline's a revelation.
America, listen to me. Stop letting, whoa, I'm reading the wrong monologue. Holy shit. Here we go. So tonight we're talking, continuing on our journey, human origins. This is Egypt part 2. We're going to focus on the actual true nature, the real relationship between Israel, the Hebrews, and the Egyptians. Myths are not bedtime stories. They are operating systems. Every civilization that ever learned how to rule large populations figured out the same thing. You don't control humans with chains, you control them with stories. Stories tell people who they are, who the heroes are, who the villains are, who deserves power, and who we must obey, and who must do the obeying. And once a myth is emotionally embedded, facts don't matter anymore. That's why tonight, part B of Egypt, we're doing something most people are never invited to do. And we're touching the foundation stone, yarmulke and all. Because if you can rewrite the origin story, you can rewrite reality. Correct? So let's talk about Hebrews and Egypt. The mainstream narrative tells us one thing over and over and over. It's drilled into our psyche since childhood. And that's that Hebrews were helpless slaves. Egyptians were the cartoon villains, chains, whips, oppression, total power imbalance. But when you actually step outside the myth and into the archaeological, the economic, and the geopolitical context of the ancient world, something very different actually begins to emerge. What we see instead of slavery between the Hebrews and the Egyptians is localized labor agreements. So not chattel slavery as modern minds imagine it, but structured labor systems that were common across ancient civilizations. Skilled labor, rotational labor, contractual service that was tied to food, land, protection, and trade. Egypt didn't build its empire on broken slaves. It built it on organized human capital. And I'll go into why that matters. So the moment you change Hebrews from powerless victims into participants within a complex civilization, the entire mythological hierarchy shifts. So the victim mythology is one of the most powerful tools of control. We see that happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota right now. If a people believe they were born powerless, rescued only by divine intervention, then authority must always come from above and never from within. But if the Hebrews were embedded in Egyptian society, learning astronomy, law, mathematics, theology, symbolism, then suddenly Moses isn't leading ignorant slaves out of darkness. He's extracting initiates. And initiates are dangerous to empires. And this is where the matrix glitches. Egypt wasn't just a civilization, it was a mastery school system. Its priesthood guarded knowledge about consciousness, cosmology, vibration, and the divine order. So now ask yourself, why would later religious institutions want that connection softened or all out erased? Because knowledge of human potential breaks control. So myths are designed to do three things. One, it's to define your relationship to authority, define your relationship to God, and three, define your relationship to yourself. If God is always external, wrathful, and accessed only through intermediaries, then you are controllable. If your ancestors were always enslaved and rescued, then obedience becomes one of the virtues. But if human origins include co-creation, divine intelligence, and the conscious participation, then the spell is broken. So that's why decoding Egypt matters. That's why decoding the Hebrew-Egyptian relationship matters. That's why myths are rewritten again and again by governments, priesthoods, and empires. And it's not to preserve truth, it's to manage power. The Matrix isn't technology, it's narrative, partially. Narrative is a big part of the Matrix. And once you see that myths aren't meant to enlighten you, but to train you, you start reading scripture, history, and religion very differently. Not as chains, but as clues. Because the truth is never fully erased. You can't fully erase the truth, but the truth, especially our ancient truths, are buried in symbolism. And the people who learn to read the symbols can't be controlled by stories anymore. That's why human origins are dangerous knowledge. And that's why we are talking about it on my show. So welcome all of you. I don't know if the two of you are actually still there. I hope you are. The interesting thing about the subscriber stuff is there's a waiting list because it's still kind of like being rolled out by Meta. So not everybody gets accepted to the subscriber program right away. So since I only have about 30 subscribers, the attendance on my shows are pretty light. Hey, Thomas. Okay, so my live viewer count isn't working. Glad you're there, Thomas. Thomas, you are going to get a whole bunch of show notes. You're going to get the entire packet once I'm done with these human origins series. You're going to get the entire packet of show notes for that entire series. So they're yours. Save them. I'm going to be touring here soon on some huge podcasts. So save them because they might be worth something, Thomas. They might be worth something later. If I can only dream in my humble existence. Let me get this off of me. I'm already getting hot and my ears are falling out, and let me readjust myself and get comfortable because this one's not going to be too long, but this episode is going to kind of jump around because basically when it comes to the Hebrews and the Egyptians, like the Exodus story obviously is like the biggest story known to man. The one, because how the Hebrews were basically slaves is thrown in our face like every fucking week of our life. So we are going over, were the Israelites, were the Hebrews actually slaves to Egypt? And once we find out that truth, we're going to examine why they would want to lie to us about something like that. Why would they want us to have this belief system, because I think it's really important to know why when we're dealing with the fact that every available part of human consumption is in control of by someone with a Jewish last name. Like, what in the fuck is actually going on? And then we're going to talk about the Bolsheviks, and then we're going to talk about why the Jewish population keeps getting kicked out of like country after country after country. And we will go into the Talmud as soon as I am done. So after we get through this part, we're going to go into Rome, and then basically this episode will become more relevant once we get into modern day history, because what is the point to the rest of my podcast if we don't understand what it is I'm doing? Why am I going over the human origins? Because that is the reason for what I am doing with answering the duty given to me by God to show how I woke up, why I woke up, and all the ways that actually comes into play, how to work that Rubik's Cube, how to put that million-piece puzzle together. And I'm doing this because when we start to understand the past, we understand why everything is the way it is today. So this episode will come back into play once we get to modern day, and start covering like World War II and, World War I. And so, these subscriber episodes, they are for the learners, the people who are my conspiracy buffs, people who like to learn and, not afraid to ask questions and go against question the mainstream, just like Charlie did. Charlie Kirk was doing, just like the Apostle Paul tells us to do. Yes, Thomas, it is definitely about control, because the biggest commodity right now in the universe is your mind. I mean, that's the most valuable thing, is your mind. It's the most powerful thing that exists in the universe next to God, because, well, it's part of God. Your consciousness. It's connected to the conscious realm, the quantum realm. So everything is about who has the right to rule. Is it the light or the dark? And the cooperation of the consciousness involves our behavior too. So they would have to compete for your consciousness. All right, so I am taking a break from smoking. So I don't have one of my smokes, but I do have a soda. Cheers. Salud. Prost. Para los perritos. And we'll say skol today. Skol. Because today we are fighting a battle against the Jews. And I have rum. That'll be here in 15 minutes to go into said Arctic Zone cup. So he's going to put it in the Trump cup for me. All right, Thomas. Let's go on a ride together, baby. All right, ancient origins. Now we are getting to the Hebrews. So the Hebrews and Egypt, truth, myth, memory, and matrix programming. So we are going to talk about in this episode how the Jews were actually not slaves for the most part. Slavery did exist in Egypt like it did anywhere else. We're going to talk about how the Jews were actually the first ones to enslave the Hebrews were the first ones to actually enslave the Egyptians. And then it got reversed. But they actually had localized labor agreements with the Egyptians. I'm going to answer that carefully, historically, and honestly, because this topic is exactly where the Matrix narrative forms on both sides when certainty basically outruns evidence. So because of the work of the Jews, this research was very hard to do because of the fact that they are so deeply involved in tech. And if you don't have books, paper, print, old books, anything online that's digital can be edited retroactively in retrospect to fit narrative. So the truth on this matter was really hard to put together. A lot of it I had to go off my memory, because a lot of the stuff that I found 15 years ago is gone. I had to use a little help from AI to help me dig. And I'll tell you, funny experience with AI doing this. It was really, really, really testy to not say anything negative about the Jews. It'll talk shit about anybody else, but it will not talk shit about any of the Jews or anyone who supports the Jews. It'll talk shit on Trump, but it won't on, Biden or Obama. So there's definitely bias that exists on the internet. And when you have Donald Trump, who is doing this push for AI and then basically hired Palantir and Bezos, and he's got the Jews all surrounding him. And I don't think that's ever not going to happen when it comes to politics. To me, it's inconsequential now. I was mad about it for the last 3 months about how much Trump is like kissing Israel's ass. But I'm a realist, and I do realize that there's not much anybody can do about it. And if you want to stay alive and get 90% of your job done, you probably should do that versus sticking it to 10% of the problem and then getting yourself killed. And I think Donald Trump knows that. If you notice, he doesn't really kiss their ass verbally a lot. He just does what he needs to do, and that's it. I think he knows that a lot of us are waking up, and he's just going to we're relying on each other to wake everyone up. And if that continues as a tradition, then eventually those of us who are awake, who go into office on the local level and move our way up to, to higher levels, will go in. That's my goal, at least. We'll go in free of these chains of Israel so we can actually take care of our country. And we can, hey, Christopher, and actually put our country first, and then actually stop the tyranny that is happening around the world, because I think that it starts with the Zionists, and it is going to take America to stop the Zionists. And so we are going to expose in this episode how the Hebrews were not slaves under Egypt. They had localized labor agreements with them. Because, like I said, this topic is exactly where the Matrix narrative forms on both sides. Narratives from on both sides when certainty outruns the evidence. So, here we're going to talk about how modern spiritual programming often relies on old foundational myths about obedience, suffering, and deliverance. The traditional story of the Hebrews enslaved by Egypt and rescued by Moses is culturally, it's a very powerful story, but it's not exactly an accurate historical record. And there is some common sense things that we can ask ourselves when we do research. When something doesn't add up to you in the common sense way, explore that, suss it out. So, how many people were in Egypt at that time during the Exodus? Is it plausible, based on the number, that a huge horde of people could leave in one night? So, especially, hold on, y'all, my eyelashes are bothering me. Especially knowing that there were no cars, they had wagon. Most people had donkeys. If you had money, you had horses. But although the Exodus story is culturally powerful, it's not entirely historically accurate. And one website that we are going to use a lot, which I'm going to show you, this website is egyptimmigration.org. Okay, so this is what it looks like, as you can see right here. There's a lot of information that I pulled from here, and so we will reference that quite a bit. So what this website is saying is that there's no actual direct or conclusive archaeological evidence that confirms the biblical account of Hebrew slavery in Egypt or a large-scale exodus as described in the Bible. Now, that's a key phrase, as described in the Bible. It's not saying there wasn't an exodus of some sort, but it's saying as described in the Bible. So what archaeologists have not discovered is Egyptian records that explicitly document Israelites as a distinct ethnic group as slaves. So you have only one group saying that this happened, but in Egyptian records, they cannot find any record of slaves. So like, you would want to keep record of your slave. You would want receipts for how much the slave cost, in case the slave died, you got the slave sick, you wanted to trade your slaves. You would have records, sale records, like most any other place. And for as advanced as Egypt was, and they kept birth records, as we just covered in the last episode, this is something they would do, is keep records. So there were no records of a distinct ethnic group as slaves. That doesn't mean that there were not Hebrews that weren't slaves, but there was no distinct record as a entire ethnic group like what we know of with Africa or the island of Britain or Europe during the Viking times. Physical evidence, archaeologists have not discovered physical evidence of a large population migrating through the Sinai desert. That's a big key. And Egyptian records they have not discovered Egyptian records describing the 10 plagues or a large-scale slave revolt. So there was no record of any of the 10 plagues, which you guys could look those up if you don't remember what they are. So this lack is not unusual. It's considerable, it says, but not unusual. This website says, defeats, internal crisis, and escaped slave populations, particularly those that would reflect badly on the state, were hardly recorded in the Egyptian records. So is it possible that they just wanted to hide it and didn't write it down? Maybe. There is evidence of, although there is no direct evidence for the presence of Hebrews in particular in Egypt, there's substantial archaeological evidence that Semitic speaking people of Canaan had inhabited Egypt during the second millennium before our Common Era, which is the era that's linked to the Bible, the era conventionally linked to the Bible account. So the key evidence includes the Brooklyn Papyrus, the archaeological discovery in Avaris, a painting in a tomb in the Beni Hassan. So, like I said, slavery did happen all around the world, but in Egypt, they did keep records, and very well records. So the prisoners of war, foreign workers, debt slaves, they were commonly employed on agriculture and construction work, as well as household service. Papyrus records testify that Egyptian society included foreign slaves. However, they got paid, and they were taxed 20% of their income. So it wasn't the same concept of, chattel slavery in later times. So the chattel slavery of the Americas, by the time, the movie The Ten Commandments was made, that is what they depicted in that movie, whips and chains. So, we'll jump back over to my notes here. So in this next segment, we're going to explore what really happened between the early Hebrews or the related Semitic people and ancient Egypt, and why the myth took the shape that it did. So for this first video that I'm going to play for you, it is on YouTube. It is about 7 minutes, almost 8 minutes. And it is on, is there evidence for Israelites in Egypt? So this is a part 2 of a 12-part series.
About 180 miles northeast of Cairo is the small Muslim village of Esbet Rushdi, known as Tel El Daba. The fields outside of Esbet Rushdi were first excavated in 1885 by Swiss archaeologist and biblical scholar Henry Edouard Neville, and the site has been the source of multiple digs and just as many opinions as to whether this is the ancient city of Avaris, once the capital city of Hyksos and home to an ancient Semitic people, possibly the descendants of Jacob and his family. This is thought to be what the Bible calls the land of Goshen. Justin, my brother...
So remember the land of Goshen, that is where Moses met his wife Sarah.
...in-law traveled with us as our story producer and helped me visualize what it may have been like for the Hebrews to live in a place like this. Well, this is a huge contrast from being in Cairo yesterday and visiting with Miriam. More rural, but we're still surrounded by apartments and a school and mosques.
Yeah, you can hear the mosque. And actually, when we flew into Egypt, I wasn't expecting it to be quite that brown. This is very, very different.
Right. Where we are is Tel El Daba.
Right. Tel El Daba has significance because this location is believed to be one of the 2 store cities that Pharaoh had the Israelites build, Ramses. It's also known as Avaris. So you can see some of the dig sites that they brought out here. There's an Austrian team back in the late 90s, went on through the first, decade of the 21st century. So part of the story here is just how much the Israelites would have actually loved living in this land of Goshen.
Right. So Genesis and following that family gets us down into Egypt because Exodus 1 talks about 70 people came down when they came down with Israel's family as they came down to be delivered by Joseph. And so there's some people that speculate maybe one of the palaces that was found here at Tel El Daba may have been Joseph's palace.
It's pretty cool, actually, looking at the evidence, because some of it doesn't fit Egypt, but it has like an Egypt flavor to it. So it's one of those things that you start to read Exodus and it almost feels like a fairy tale. And until you start seeing, there are actual places, locations that we're looking around us and we can see dig sites where, no, the Semitic people had a presence here. This event really did happen. Now let's get on to the important thing, which is the story that they went through. There's still a lot of pot shards around, and it's exciting to me. This is my first time in a situation like this. It's like 3,000 years old worth of history, but people just walking by and using it in each way. But there's nothing to see here.
So there's a guy that's associated with the site. He works here. He's given us permission to go and take a look at some of the things that they found here. They were afraid that if they left them out, that people would have taken them. So they put them, some of them are on display, some of them are in storage. Our fixer has negotiated with them, and the team is going to be able to go and take a look at some of this. So I have no idea what town we're in.
So they just took the camera down. We're waiting outside the gate. There's the police, the national security, and the army. And we need to get permits for all of them. So we're waiting right now. And hopefully they let us through.
We got permission to go look at these publicly displayed archaeological discoveries from Tel Al-Daba. Not sure what they're going to be, but I'm going to go with my camera, and we'll just see what God has provided for us here. And one of them is pretty amazing. You know, we were talking about Abraham and the promise that he received.
Sorry, y'all.
And then talking about Joseph being sold into Egypt and how God used that providentially to preserve his family.
Thomas, I just see that you said you're going to add them to the Luna Shrine. I didn't know you had a Luna Shrine. Well, JK. I hope that shrine is sparkly and full of lots of witchy shit from nature.
So his father and his brothers and their families all come down. 70 people come down to Egypt. And then you get to Exodus, where there's a pharaoh who comes to power that doesn't know Joseph and his family. We're told that there were some items here that were found there during the Austrians' archaeological dig over approximately 30 years. You see these canopic jars, which would have been used during burial. And what's interesting at Tel Al-Daba is the burial practices.
Those are cool.
Were not like the burial practices of Egyptians. They were more Semitic in nature, and then they changed over.
Which Semitic culture is actually fascinating. They were so spiritually connected. I'll tell you what.
Over time, and included some Egyptian practices, but they never fully became Egyptian from what I understand. So you also have this coffin. You see the lid, and then even on this side, you see even smaller coffins that would have been used for children. Which, when you think about the Exodus story, especially Exodus chapter 1, and then another thing that we've been trying to learn more about are all these little small statues that indicated the wealth of the people that lived there. All of those came from Tel Al-Daba. And so there was a long period of time in that town's history, that city's history, where they were really wealthy and they were doing really well, which is consistent with why Joseph's family came down in the first place. It was to promote life, and they did really well until that Pharaoh arose that didn't know him. There is a tension that exists in our minds, knowing that Egypt was not merely a place of slavery and oppression, but also a place of refuge and safety.
It's fascinating to think about how in the Exodus story, you've got Egypt is a place of slavery you want to get out of. In the Jesus story, Egypt was a haven for a time. And both phrases, out of Egypt I call my son, get Israel out and get Jesus out. As it's just fascinating to get a fuller narrative. God has plans for Egypt, and it's not all punitive. Some of it is helping further the Savior. He's bringing salvation about through Egypt.
Okay. So, continuing on. So, why? Clearly, there were Semitic people in Egypt, but what would be the point to having the narrative that we all know today? So false narratives serve as control systems. True spiritual freedom comes from seeing the mechanisms of myth for what they are. So historically, who were the people we now call the Hebrews? Let's get into it.
Jerusalem has been the center of many civilizations throughout history. First founded by the Jebusites, the city was conquered by King David.
Jesuits.
Then became the capital of the Kingdom of Israel. Over time, Babylonian Persia, Rome and many other empires ruled on these lands. During the Roman period, Jerusalem, the site of Jesus' crucifixion, became a holy city for Christianity, conquered by the Muslims in the 7th century. Jerusalem became a holy center for Islam. It changed hands during the Crusades in the Middle Ages and remained under Muslim rule for many years during the Ottoman period. With the establishment of the modern state of Israel in the 20th century, the city's political structure changed again. Today, Jerusalem is recognized as a holy city for the 3 major Abrahamic religions. Jerusalem has been the center of many civilizations.
Now we're gonna go to this one. All right, let me back it up. So, all right. Evolution of, oh my gosh. Evolution of Israel. All right. Canaanite origins. Okay, so this is circa 2000 BCE, before Jesus was born. Exactly 2,000 years before he was born. All right. Kingdom of Israel, circa 1000 BCE. Went into Babylonian exile, 586 BCE. Roman Judea and the Second Temple was formed in the 1st century. So this would be, I believe, after Jesus died, or at year 0, during Jesus' birth. All right, so the diaspora and the medieval existence 1,000 years ago, 26 years ago exactly. So this would be 1,000 years after the death of Christ. Salut. All right. Now we have the Eastern European chattel life in the 1800s. All right, now the Zionist movement begins in the 1800s, sometime between the late 1800s and early 1917. This most likely happened around 1914, around World War I. Holocaust, then World War II. So it's important to note, let me show you that there were more groups. All right. So there were Jews, Roma gypsies, people with disabilities, Polish people, Soviet prisoners of war. There were political opponents, including that was the Jehovah's Witnesses, the cult that I grew up in. They were a purple triangle instead of a Star of David. The triangle is because when you study the Jehovah's Witnesses roots, you find out that they are Freemasons. So that's why the triangle. So he also targeted gays, asocials, which is an individual labeled as a criminal. We call them antisocial people today, black people, and Freemasons. So again, the Freemasons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Freemasons were considered a threat to the Nazi state. He also went after preachers, pastors, anybody who had a resistance, and other people from occupied territories. This number here, 6 million, were murdered in the final solution. I personally believe that it was more like 6 million total and not 6 million Jews. So what symbol did the Roma gypsies wear in Holocaust? Y'all don't mind my typos. I'm just trying to hurry. All right. So they wore a black triangle, the gypsies. The Jehovah's Witnesses had a purple triangle. You can see that in the, oh my gosh, JEHOVAH. You can see that in the Holocaust Museum. And you can see here is a picture of the purple triangle that was cut off clothes. Jehovah's Zogen. This basically says here is it's just basically explaining that this was the symbol that they used in Germany in the camps for the Jehovah's Witnesses. So there's, all right. So now we are just going to continue on. So these people, these Semites were later called Israelites, were part of the Northwest Semitic speaking populations in the Levant. So going back to immigration.org, it explains that, all right, so let's just look up who the Semitic speaking populations of the Levant are. So let's go to browser. We're going to do that up here. All right, so the Semitic speaking populations have inhabited the Levant for millennia, appearing by the 3rd millennium BC, forming in the foundation of the region's ancient and modern demographics. Major groups include the Canaanites, Phoenicians, Hebrews. So the Canaanites were made up of Phoenicians and Hebrews. So Arameans and later Arab populations. So they were Semitic speaking people, such as Eblite and Amorite. They were part of the early Bronze Age. They had a Canaanite identity. They had Aramaic culture. Their language branches were mostly classified under the Northwest Semitic branch, which included Canaanite, which was Hebrew, Phoenician, Moabite, and Arabic. Modern populations with a continuous historically rooted presence include Arabs, Jews, Sumerians, and Syriac Christians. While many believe they originated in the Arabian Peninsula, some evidence suggests Levantine origin for Proto-Semitic speakers around 37 CE. So what's Levantine or Levant? That's the tribe of Levi. So when you are in the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures and that part of the Bible, when they're going through the genealogy, there is a lot spoken on the tribe of Levi. All right. So, archaeological evidence clearly shows Semitic groups living and working in Egypt during the Middle and New Kingdom period. So they were there, peoples connected linguistically to those later known as Hebrews. So an example would be the Brooklyn Papyrus lists Semitic names in Egypt. The tomb art at the Beni Hassan depicts Semitic foreign workers, trades, or migrants entering Egypt. And now we are going to watch a video about this. All right, let's head over to our browser and send you to this video.
The Canaanites, the forgotten civilization. Long before the rise of Israel, the land of Canaan was home to one of the earliest and most mysterious civilizations. Stretching from modern-day Lebanon to southern Israel, the Canaanites were master traders, connecting Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean. Their cities, Tyre, Sidon, and Ugarit, flourished with wealth and culture. They worshipped gods like Baal and El,
Right. Look,
leaving
that
behind
is the Gaza Strip. You should recognize that. Now today known as Palestine.
temples and inscriptions that still puzzle historians today. But their world was fragile. As Egyptian pharaohs, invading sea peoples, and the early Israelites clashed over Canaan, their identity...
So when you actually know your biblical history, your maps, you pay attention to the genealogies, you realize Jesus was not Jewish. Jesus, because Mary and David come out of this bloodline. He was actually Palestinian. Fun fact.
Faded into history. Yet, their legacy lived on, shaping the ancient world's alphabets, myths, and cultures.
So does it, when you see this location and you go through the bloodlines and you realize that Jesus is Palestinian, doesn't it make sense to you now why Israel has had a hard-on to make Gaza a parking lot? They believe that Jesus Christ's punishment for allowing the divine to inhabit his body is basically witchcraft, and that he is burning in hellfire and excrement right now. So why would they have any friendly feelings towards anyone in that area where he's from? An important nuance to note is that there are not tribal Israelites yet at this point in time, but ancestors, relatives, or ethno-linguistically related groups did exist. So let me take you over to my next video real quick. I'm going to cue that up, make sure it's paused, and switch over here. All right. So this is a 6-minute video.
Welcome to Expedition Bible. In this video, I travel to Egypt to explore one of the most significant discoveries ever made in biblical archaeology.
So this video is going to support the biblical narrative. This is called Israel, Evidence for Ancient Israel Discovered in Egypt. So I told you it's going to bounce back and forth. So I'm going to show you, I have to show you both. Because not everything written in the Bible is incorrect. It's just, how is it weaponized, basically. So
Flinders Petrie is considered the father figure of the field of archaeology. And in his book, 70 Years in Archaeology, he tells the story of a discovery that he made in Egypt back in 1896. Petrie wrote, "To the astonishment of the rest of our party, I said at dinner that night, 'This will be better known in the world than anything else I have found.' He was right. 70 years in archaeology, and this was his greatest find." So I'm here at the Tel Aviv airport. I'm getting ready to leave the modern state of Israel to go explore evidence for ancient Israel. My first stop in Egypt is Luxor, ancient Thebes, where across the Nile River lay the ruins of the mortuary temples, where the pharaohs of old were once worshipped as gods. This one is the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Merneptah, who ruled Egypt from about 1213 to 1204 BC. And this is where, on a winter day in 1896, Flinders Petrie was excavating. Petrie wrote, "The site of Merneptah's temple was disastrously dull. I was tempted to leave it as fruitless. Then, in the last corner to be cleared, there lay a black granite stele, over 10 feet high and 5 wide." I'm standing in the mortuary temple of the Pharaoh Merneptah. And this is where Flinders Petrie was excavating when he found this inscription. Today, you can go to the Cairo Museum and see the real stele that this is a replica of. The Merneptah stele. A stele is a stone shaped to stand upright and bear an inscription. We still use them today in cemeteries. Petrie wrote, "On looking beneath it, there was the inscription of Merneptah. I had the ground cut away below, blocking up the stele on stones, so that one could crawl in and lie on one's back, reading a few inches from one's nose." The excavation's epigrapher was a man named Spiegelberg, and Petrie wrote about him when he says, "He lay there copying for an afternoon." This just cracks me up because, I mean, think about that. Think about what they did in 1896, where a hole is dug under an inscription, and an epigrapher goes into that hole like a gopher, and then spends a whole afternoon with the inscription literally this far away from his face with a candle, translating all of these words. I mean, that is one tough epigrapher. He lay there copying for an afternoon and came out saying, "There are names, and one I don't know is Sirar." "Why, that is Israel," said I. "So it is, and won't the reverends be pleased," was his reply. This is a replica of it here in the place of its discovery. The real one we can now go see in the Cairo Museum. So here we are in the Egyptian Museum. This is the Merneptah stele. I've done a lot of digging and found a lot of things. But if I found something like this 10.5-foot inscription, I would freak out because, I mean, look at this thing. Can you imagine 10.5-foot stele covered with an inscription on both sides? So on this side is the most famous name found in this entire inscription, which is right down here, the name Israel. It's agreed upon that this says Israel, and this is the earliest mention of the name Israel found outside of the Bible. The inscription of Merneptah dates to around 1210 BC. The inscription describes who Merneptah and his army fought with in Canaan. The translation reads, "Canaan is plundered, Ashkelon is conquered, Gezer is seized, Yenoam is made non-existent, Israel is laid waste." Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yenoam are followed by the city-state symbol. These three city-states were ruled by kings. There is no city-state symbol shown for the name Israel. Instead, the symbol for a foreign people is shown. This means that in 1210 BC, Israel is described as a people that has not yet formed into a nation and therefore is without a king. According to biblical chronology, the date 1210 BC falls in the Judges period, where we find in the book of Judges this repeating phrase, "In those days, Israel had no king." So we have here this huge inscription, 10.5 feet high, 5 feet wide, inscribed on both sides. And yet what makes this find so significant is the discovery on it of a single word, the name Israel, found in the Bible over 2,400 times. And this wasn't even the first time that it had been found in an inscription through archaeology, but this was the earliest mention of the name Israel outside of the Bible. This is yet another example of the details in the Bible being verified through the details of an inscription dug up through archaeology. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and you'll want to watch this related video where I travel to Sudan to see another inscription that is the earliest mention.
Oh, we watched this one already.
About 180 miles northeast of Cairo is the small Muslim village of Esbet Rushdi, known as Tel El Daba.
Here we go.
And the memory of slavery in Egypt and the divine deliverance of Israel from Egypt, this is a...
So Semitic people in Egypt were often workers, not a nation of slaves.
reconfiguration of these memories of the rise and decline and disappearance of the Egyptian Empire.
Professor Endel, I have a question. If we have this unpleasant historic memory, and as Israelites, and we were enslaved, and it's kind of shameful period, disgraceful period. Why would we derive our nation origin from slaves?
No, this is a good question, and it is.
So he's basically asking the question, why would Israel ground themselves in this story?
Unusual for a people to derive their origins from slaves, because being a slave is a shameful condition. And so, yeah, you would think that it'd be more natural for a people to derive their origins from glorious heroes, from, kings, or from, the god.
Invent a nice story.
Yeah, it would make a nice story. So I think that, in a sense,
because it's it's using victimhood to gain support.
Memory of origins out of Egyptian slavery is a genuine historical memory.
That's why they are the masters of Marxism.
So I think it comes because it really was the case that everyone was slaves to Pharaoh, even though they were slaves to Pharaoh in Canaan. But this idea of having been in this period of Egyptian bondage, it's very interesting that in the biblical account, the memory of Egyptian bondage is 400 years, or plus or minus. The Egyptian empire lasted about that long in the land of Canaan. So there's this memory of a long period of Egyptian domination, and I think that's really stems from
in the land of Canaan. I just showed you where that was.
Historical memory of the Egyptian empire, of the rule of the Egyptian empire, and this feeling of having been slaves, but having...
So they were occupied by Egypt, the land of Canaan, for about 400 years.
Been delivered by a miracle by God. Now, let me also add, during the Egyptian empire, there were many Canaanites who were taken into Egypt as slaves. Okay, this is one of the things that Egypt derived from the colonies. They derived a lot of slaves. So there were a lot of slaves who were taken down into Egypt. When the Egyptian empire collapsed, I think it's reasonable to assume that some of those Canaanite slaves went back to Canaan. So I don't want to say that it's only a memory of being enslaved to Pharaoh in Canaan, because I think it's very possible that some of the early Israelites had been enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. But my point is, and this is something that the archaeologists stress, it couldn't have been that many.
Because remember, they're the ones that claim that they built the pyramids off their backs. So we have an inconsistency here. Some slaves that were Hebrew were in Egypt, but there were all slaves from all over the place. We went over the reasons why they would be slaves. We went over the fact last week that they would be being paid and taxed. And now we have bringing in a totally new location that in reality, this 400-year period was in the land of Canaan. Okay. And then, so that's an occupation. That's more of an occupation, right? So where would they have left if they exited from Canaan? So if this 400-year period actually occurred in the land of Canaan, then you have to question the Exodus story.
Many people who had actually been slaves in Egypt.
What's up, Rashad?
Most of the early Israelites, there's no indication of any large-scale exodus from Egypt. There's no indication of any
yes, that Rashad.
Years of wandering in the wilderness of the Sinai by any substantial population of people. And there's no indication of a large-scale incursion into Canaan by people from the outside. So there's simply no evidence for any of that. But it's entirely possible that some Canaanite slaves could have escaped from Egypt and come into and settled in this region of early Israel. My question is, why would the majority of people who hadn't been in Egypt accept that story as their own?
Right, right.
And I think it makes sense that they would have accepted that story as their own because they too had been slaves of Egypt. They had been living in the house of Egyptian bondage for hundreds of years. So I think that there's a combination
So he can't go against the narrative. So he's finding a way to tell you the truth without saying the wrong words that would get him docked. So that's like if Russia were to come over here and like occupy us for 400 years, you would feel encroached upon by them.
Of Canaanites as slaves in Egypt, but I think most of them would have been Canaanite slaves of Egypt in the land of Canaan.
Yeah, and we know from the Merneptah's stele that Israelites were oppressed by Merneptah, and he almost annihilated the nation, according to his recording.
According to Merneptah's text, he destroyed Israel, that he destroyed their seed, and there's none of them left. So you can see.
So that Pharaoh, according to what he wrote, killed them all, and that there were none of them left.
See that even, and particularly in these Egyptian steles and royal accounts, there's a lot of exaggeration. There's a lot of reimagining of the past. So there must have been some military confrontation and defeat of the Israelites by Merneptah. I mean, this is not remembered in the Bible at all. But this is an example of the kind of Egyptian oppression of the people in Canaan that they would have felt. I mean, they're defeated by Egypt. So again, they're slaves of Egypt, even if it doesn't last for very long. And they, this becomes a part of their past, and their imagination makes it stronger and stronger and stronger. So the Merneptah thing is a nice point that shows my picture of how Egypt was oppressing Israel and the people who became Israel in the land of Canaan.
How would you?
Okay, so this next part, let me see. Do I want this part? No, I don't. Okay, so this next video. This video talks about the biblical narrative as a reference point for us. I know a lot of us know the narrative, but let's watch it anyway.
A new Pharaoh arises, and he doesn't remember Joseph. He enslaves the people because they're becoming too numerous and becoming a threat. So he puts them to work and embitters their lives, building store cities of Pithom and Ramses, and makes them create bricks out of mud and straw.
It was intriguing to see this type of construction in different parts of Egypt. Were any of these bricks molded by the hands of Israelite slaves? However, Mansour was quick to remind me that these types of mud bricks are present throughout Egypt's history and don't prove any connection to the Israelites. In his search for evidence that fits the idea of Israelite slavery, Professor James Hoffmeyer focuses on the first half of the New Kingdom because he favors a Ramesses Exodus date. There he finds a very interesting set of evidence. It states in the biblical story that the Hebrews were supposed to make bricks from mud and straw. Is there any evidence of that?
We have two lines of evidence that this practice referred to in Exodus chapter 1 and Exodus chapter 5 really was the sort of thing going on. We have the depiction in the tomb of Rechmireh. He was a vizier or prime minister under Thutmose III in the 15th century. And there we can see POWs, both Semites from Canaan and Syria, working alongside prisoners of war from Nubia, black Africans. And there they are making bricks. overseen by Egyptian.
There's the, let me go back it up. You see black people, and then and you see brown people, like the guy up to the left.
Alongside prisoners of war from Nubia, black Africans. And there they are making bricks, overseen by Egyptian taskmasters with sticks. And so it's very clear that this was the treatment of prisoners of war. And we see these foreigners making bricks in southern Egypt for a building project at Karnak Temple. And I'm sure that picture could be replicated to other parts.
So in the hieroglyphics, they found POWs making these bricks.
Parts of Egypt, especially in the north. Secondly, we also have, from the same time period, the 15th century, the 18th dynasty, we also have pictures of agricultural work, especially work in the vineyards, picking grapes, stomping on grapes to make juice and wine. Here again, we find these same prisoners of war engaged in agriculture. Exodus 1:14 actually says they worked in brick and mortar and agriculture. So interestingly, the very two areas the Bible says the Israelites were forced to work in, agriculture and construction work, is the very two places we see this sort of work going on in private tombs in Egypt in the 15th century BC.
Now, were all these prisoners of war, could these have been people such as the Bible states that were actually there that became suspicious and then were forced into labor?
In the case of the tomb of Rechmireh, tomb 100 in the Theban necropolis, it actually tells us they were hawked, they were plundered, they were prisoners brought back from the king's campaigns. So, and these happen to be in the south in Luxor. The problem is we don't have corresponding tombs for what was going on in the Delta, where the Hebrews were. So we lack that kind of evidence. Also during the 15th century BC, we have the beginnings of the deportations of prisoners of war from the wars of the pharaohs Thutmose I, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II. These are bringing prisoners of war both from Syria and Canaan as well as from Nubia to the south. All these prisoners of war are flooding into Egypt and are being pressed into hard labor for the state. So we have both the old Semitic population, second, third generation of whom are still around in the 15th, 14th, 13th century, and then you have the new population of Semites who were brought in as POWs from the campaigns of the Egyptian pharaohs. So there was a significant network of foreign people living in Egypt during the New Kingdom.
While this is good evidence for the presence of Semitic slaves doing the right types of work, prisoners of war do not match the Bible's account of the early Israelites. Meanwhile, David Rowe pointed to a different set of evidence that fits the pattern found in Egypt's Middle Kingdom, beginning with finds from Avaris.
Well, what happened next? What does the archaeological record show?
What we then see is that the graves of these people, we begin to see in the bones deterioration in the quality of life. We see Harris lines in the bones, which indicate famine, shortage of food and nutrients. These people suddenly have become impoverished. Not only that, but we start to see larger houses, which seem to be Egyptian in design, and then smaller houses attached to them, which seem to be servants' houses. And this is what we see for the very first time. And we even find papyri with lists of slaves with Semitic names on them at this period as well.
Tell me more about the bones.
If we look at the cemetery population, that's the dead, if you like, and that's the evidence we have of the living, is the dead. And we look at their graves, we find something very interesting happens. At the beginning, these people seem to prosper. The quality of their lives is very good. But all of a sudden, at some point in the story, we see a degeneration. We see a degeneration in the burials and the actual graves themselves. The investigation of the anthropological data has shown us that we are dealing with people who lived probably to about 32 to 34 years of age and then died. That's the typical life expectancy of the time. So we're not talking about a people who prospered and went on to live into their 50s and 60s, as you might expect. These people had really tough lives. So how do we explain that? What is the mechanism that we would understand why these people only lived to such a short age? And the obvious answer is slavery.
So you're saying that this group that came in that was prosperous then fell on hard times?
Yeah. We've got a situation of prosperity followed by a lack of prosperity and a shortage of life. So it seems very clear that these Asiatic peoples, these people have come from the...
What I take issue with him is with what he's saying is that the only evidence of this deterioration in the bodies that they've uncovered would be slavery. Well, not necessarily, because if he's saying also famine and a deterioration of conditions, wealthy countries are who had slaves. If you had slaves, you had wealth. You did not have wealth, you couldn't have slaves because you couldn't feed them. So, there's my issue there. So to me, this matches more along the lines with in Egypt, contract labor and actual possible slavery as a whole on the Hebrews existing farther away in Gaza area.
The north, speaking a Semitic language, who first of all prospered in this region, have suddenly been enslaved.
Is there any physical evidence that there was slavery of Hebrew-type people in Egypt?
There's one particular document which is quite amazing. It's called the Brooklyn Papyrus. And this actually is a list of domestic servants from one estate. We have maybe up to 100 people listed as slaves in
But a domestic servant is not the same as a slave.
Egypt. When we look at those names, 70% of them are Semitic names. And you can literally pick off Israelite names in there. Menachem, Issachar, and Asher, the names of two other tribes of Israel. Shifra, one of the Hebrew midwives in the Exodus story, a name that appears in this document.
Sifra.
These are Hebrew Israelite slaves, and they're in a papyrus from the 13th dynasty, not from the 19th dynasty, not from the time of Ramesses II in the New Kingdom, but from the 13th dynasty, the Middle Kingdom.
What does this mean to you? What does it say?
This is real evidence for the time when the Israelites were in Egypt as slaves. It's when you get a text, suddenly you've got history. Archaeology, you have to interpret. When you have a text, this is something very different.
David, can you put a specific date on the Brooklyn Papyrus?
The Brooklyn Papyrus is dated to one reign. The name of the king appears on it, and the king is called Sobekotep III. Now, he's the first king of a mini dynasty in the 13th dynasty, where you have maybe 4 or 5 very powerful rulers coming to the fore, a family of strong pharaohs. And this could be the pharaoh who did not know Joseph, the one.
Side note, I caught a glance of myself on the software over here, and I'm like, whoa, I look like Catherine Zeta-Jones a little bit. She's Welsh. My maiden name is Welsh. Which is why whenever I tell Scottish people I'm mostly Scottish, they don't bat an eye, because there's a lot of dark skin, there's a lot of brown skinned people up there. Side note.
Who enslaved the Israelites, because it comes maybe 3 or 4 generations after the Middle Kingdom, when Joseph arrives in Egypt. We suddenly find this strong pharaoh, Sobekotep III, and we have this list of slaves with Israelite names.
David, the thing that I'm puzzled by is why so many Egyptologists ignore the Brooklyn Papyrus.
Well, this is the old problem again about time, isn't it? You have a situation here where, although everybody recognizes that this list is a list of Semitic slaves, and everybody recognizes that the names appearing in here are also Israelite names, these can't be the Israelites, because it's the wrong time period.
Right.
The Israelites are much later in history.
Yep.
So these people we're seeing here in this Brooklyn Papyrus in the time of Sobekotep III cannot be the Israelites.
Oh shit, Zio. I've been trying to get the men in my life to take me on a hunt all fucking since hunting season opened, because I need it desperately for my dogs, and I can't get them to do it. But I need to go hunt hogs and some deer. What are you building out? Tell me about it. I want to know. But yeah, so now we have a discrepancy with time. So location and time. So where there's contradictions, we know there are lies.
All this evidence that we're finding in Avaris, this city in Goshen in the Eastern Delta, points us to the period when the Israelites were in Egypt, and that is the period we call the Middle Bronze Age. Most Egyptologists put the period of the slavery in the New Kingdom, in the 19th dynasty, and here we are in the 13th dynasty. So the things don't match.
So that's why they disregard it.
So they put it to one side and say it's another coincidence.
I think I need a moose or an elk as well to feed my fucking pack of 8. I have 8 dogs. Well, more really. I have 6 in my own pack, and then I have 6 I'm trying to rehome. So I have 12 dogs I'm trying to feed right now. And I have learned through having these 12 dogs for a year, it was really hard to rehome this litter, that my daughter, she deserves a horse, because I thought I couldn't afford a horse. I absolutely can't afford a horse because I'm feeding 12 dogs. I can fucking afford a horse. I need to get rid of these 12 dogs. I am giving away. I was a huge litter of 11. I have half of them left, so I'm giving them away. You have to come get them yourself or pay me to bring them to you. But I have pure blood American bullies that are guarding. So these aren't the show line. They're built more naturally, more classically. Still have the extreme shape, the bully look, but these are not show bullies. These are working bullies. So if you need a dog for hunting, guarding, and also sitting on the couch, my pups are for you. They are gray line, the old school bloodline, gray line, blue line, a little bit of XB, but mostly gray line and watchdog, which is the old school XL pit bulls. And then I brought in some of the XB and the blue line for more of the bully look, and that fucked me for like 3 generations because holy shit, show dogs have lots of fucking issues, man. But yeah, cleaned that back up, and right when I get my litter back to high health, high intelligence, more of a rectangular shape than a square shape, everybody is like gun shy to get a puppy. So if you want a puppy, please come. I get one. Tell your friends. I'm giving away free pure. These are $5,000 dogs that I'm giving away for free. So, please tell your friends. Okay. So just to summarize, we have to remember that the Israelites were not captured or conquered into slavery. They were welcomed in as friends. They were relatives to Jacob, and Jacob's tribe actually married a lot of into Egyptian society. And it wasn't till centuries later that the group became more indentured servants than slaves. So there's that. So slavery did exist in ancient Egypt, but it wasn't the chattel slavery of later eras. And it included the foreign laborers, debt servants, household workers, and corvée laborers, corvier laborers. And you can find that on that website I showed you earlier. Thank you, Zio. That website is egyptimmigration.org /FAQ. What archaeological evidence exists to show that the Hebrews were ever slaves or even just lived in Egypt? So that is the link. And I am going to queue up another video here for you guys to watch.
The Bible tells a powerful story. The Israelites enslaved in Egypt, yearning for freedom. But are there clues in history? We know Canaanites, a related people, lived in Egypt. Were they slaves? Evidence is scarce, whispers in ancient texts. Some worked for pharaohs, others faced hardship. But were they Israelites? The timeline and details remain unclear. Archaeology searches for answers, but the puzzle remains unsolved. Was the Bible's story inspired by real events? Join the quest for truth. Explore ancient Egypt and the stories of its people. The Bible.
So, Thomas, about the puppy, or Zio, I also have an adult female who is 6 years old, but she's always been outside. So I'm giving her away to retire because I won't be breeding her. She's had one litter, but I won't be breeding her again. So I'm looking to retire her because I got a female off of her that's even better. But she would need to be potty trained, highly rigorous, strict schedule on potty training because she's only lived outside. All right. So she's one of my alarm bells. She's one of my perimeter guards. So she's protective of the yard, protective of the house, but super friendly with people when they're in your house. If they're not in there and you're not hanging out with them, she's not going to let them in the yard. Her name is Battlestar from Battlestar Galactica. We just call her Star. So I would love for her to have a home. She deserves a couch. So Egypt's bureaucratic records, they show foreign workers used in construction, agriculture, and craft labor, but not as a separate mass enslaved Hebrew nation. And that is from, let's see, the website Science News Today. Was there a historical exodus? Archaeological insights reveal. Some scholars, they point out that Egyptian labor systems could function similarly to a labor tax or corvée. So make sure they know this is an American bully. So it's the cousin of the American Pit Bull Terrier. These dogs are way less. So purebred American Pit Bull Terriers are dog aggressive. That's what they're bred for. A purebred is that way. So the goal in the American Bully was to have a pit bull that was more impressive in stature, but calmer and more friendly with other dogs. And that is what you get for sure. So she's great for pack life. She loves other dogs. She loves kids. She's very gentle with other kids. However, don't know how she would do with other small animals. My bloodline, I think, if you train them, this is my pet, they'll be fine. But a coon or someone else's dog or cat coming into your yard is probably not going to survive. Okay. I can show you pictures, Zio, too, if you DM me of all my pups that I have left. All of the pictures are outdated of the puppies, but you can see they're just going to be a bigger version of that. And then I have up-to-date ones of the mom. I really need to find homes quickly because the dog food quality has gone down. It takes much more dog food and actually supplementing with meat for a heavy bone breed and heavy muscle breed. And I'm having a hard time. It's getting very expensive on me. I'm having a hard time keeping weight on them. And it's not because of a lack of eating. It's because I have a huge pack and the dog food quality went down. So one dog, easier to keep full, especially if you're crate training, but to keep the food out. So I will say, like, when you get this breed, like with the change in dog food, some laws have expired and the quality's gone way down. Feed double what the bag says. And that's at the direction of my vet. Just feed double what all the shelters and vets know about this problem. So any Mastiff type breeds dealing with this too, Rottweilers, Connays, etc. So you just feed them double. But getting back to the show. So yeah, just to repeat what I said earlier, some scholars point out that Egyptian labor systems could function similarly to a labor tax or a corvée. So that's seasonal forced work tied to agricultural calendars rather than generational slavery. Thank you, Zio. Sounds good. And we will be waiting for you. Thomas says, I wonder if that's why my blue nose gets an allergic reaction to everything he eats. So Blue terriers, and blue terrier breeds and blue bull breeds. Blue, here's why he gets allergies. So just so you know, blue nose is not a bloodline. Just to be very clear, this is one of the common things I debunk that started as a backyard breeder term to market their blue pit bulls because of Old Family red nose, which is a bloodline. The red pit bulls, the red gene in the color brings a certain fire to the personality. Now, going back to dog fighting days with the pit bull, the dilute colors like blue, Isabella, or lilac, etc., were culled. And the reason why the blues and the lilacs were culled was because when they got into battles, the skin would not heal as quickly. And so through many studies on why that is, because it was definitely a thing. If you know any dog men from the past that are in their 50s or 60s, they know what I'm saying is 100%. The blue and the lilac. Blue is a dilution of black. Lilac is a dilution of chocolate. When you have a dilution gene, it weakens the skin. So the skin has less tolerance for contaminants and slows, and the healing slows. So that's why your blue pit bull is allergic to a lot of things he eats, because what he's going to be allergic to is processed proteins. Processed proteins meaning kibble, poultry-based kibble, and corn. Now, if he was having raw chicken or raw poultry, he wouldn't have the allergy. You would just have to go through the gut adjustment because the gut has to deal with all that bacteria not being cooked out. And the corn in copious amounts can cause a gluten intolerance because it's not natural for dogs to eat corn, particularly. However, corn right now is the thing that is helping me put calories on my dogs. So for breakfast, they get the good shit, the healthy shit. For dinner, they get the fast food. They get Gravy Train. And that is literally, I just checked in and weighed in my puppies today. And that Gravy Train is like it's like having a fucking double cheeseburger every day. So it's not good for long term, but because I have puppies that are growing at the same time of a calorie deficit occurring in the dog foods, because what the law actually is that change was that they can include hoof, fur, beak, bone. Bone has a little nutrition, but fur, beak, hoof, teeth, things like that have no calories. So they're allowed to include it in the caloric in the food. So the calories have actually gone down. So what I've been doing is supplementing with hot dogs and real meat and real food, like what we eat, and the Gravy Train, and mixed, and the real food is mixed in with the high quality kibble. So my dogs, I bred the allergen out when it comes to the food issue. Over the course of 3 generations, I bred that out. However, with the Gravy Train, my dogs that have, my OGs that have the allergy issues, because they're old school bloodlines, they actually, with the Gravy Train, are not being bothered, their skin and hair. And I think that's because there's really literally no meat protein in it. It's just all basically vegan. It's like all corn. So Thomas, if you want to hear what I was saying, that explanation about the food, I know my connection was breaking up. So just, I guess when the show is over and I post it, this is episode 12. When I post it, just go back to, I'll tell you right now, go back to an hour and 28 minutes in. An hour and 20 minutes in is when we started talking about the food. So, anyway, okay, Zio, I'm glad that you sent me that. I will send you pictures of the dogs that I am giving away. Like I said, I can deliver, but I charge per for travel, or you can come pick up. And even though it's for free, you still have to sign a puppy contract so I can show the state that I did my job. Wish we were closer. We're going to wipe out hundreds of hogs. Shit, I would go with you. Where do you live? We love to travel. I am also going to be planning, probably in about a year, a podcast tour. And I'm going to plan it for all of my OGs states, all of my day oneers, all of my VIPs. I'm going to plan it in those states so that you guys can see me. Zio, I would just close your app and restart it and come back to us. But so you guys can see me do a show in person, But let me try telling Zio. Okay. All right. So that information, going back to our topic about the Corvier labor or labor tax. So a labor tax, this is like you're free, right? And instead of paying dollar amounts for your tax, you're doing labor. So it was definitely more of an agreement. This is from the apus.edu. So I'll show you that website right now so you can see where I'm getting my reference material. So this is a journal that was posted in 2015 by the Saber and Scroll Historical Society. So you can see that I don't just get my information from weird sources. I actually do my research. But like I said, this was really hard to research because obviously there's an agenda to... The victor always rewrites the story. You know what I'm saying? So, the next video I would like to show you is going to basically talk about the pyramids of Egypt. Since obviously there was some question there about if the Israelites actually built those pyramids.
This Hollywood myth has been debunked by modern archaeology. The pyramids of Egypt were not built by Jewish slaves, despite what movies like The 10 Commandments might have you believe. Archaeological evidence shows that skilled Egyptian workers constructed these massive monuments, not enslaved Israelites. In fact, the Jewish people weren't even in Egypt during the pyramid building era, which ended around 1700 BCE, centuries before the biblical Exodus. Excavations have revealed worker villages with evidence of good living conditions, including medical care, has been debunked by modern archaeology. The pyramids of Egypt were not built by Jewish slaves, despite what movies like The 10 Commandments might have you believe. Archaeological evidence shows that skilled Egyptian workers constructed these massive monuments, not enslaved Israelites. In fact, the Jewish people weren't even in Egypt during the pyramid building era, which ended around 1700.
And here's a good critical thinking question to ask yourself. If the Jews learned how to build these pyramids, they would know why they were being built. We wouldn't have had all these questions circulating for decades, hundreds of years. How'd they do it? How'd they do it? How'd they do it? The Jews would have just told us by now. And we don't see any pyramids in their region, in Palestine or Israel. We don't see pyramids in that area. Now there is some in Saudi Arabia, but not in Israel. So why would they not have done the same thing?
BCE, centuries before the biblical Exodus. Excavations have revealed worker villages with evidence of good living conditions, including medical care and honorable burials.
Which is what we saw at the beginning of the show tonight, was those little containers, the fact that they're paid, the fact that some of them paid their taxes off this way.
These laborers were likely farmers who worked during the Nile's annual flood season when they couldn't tend their fields.
Which goes right along with the last video that explained that this was more of like a seasonal forced work tied to the calendar, because if the Egyptians, like we learned, were so cosmically tied, an agricultural seasonal event would demand everyone to be involved to make sure that there's food for all. I mean, so it would be like the equivalent of all of us living in the pioneer days and the government saying, look, every fall every single person is required to store up their harvests. This amount needs to be checked in, blah, 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 blah. It'd be like that kind of a concept.
They were motivated by religious devotion to
Production's making a point that it's no difference than Israel forcing every citizen, once they turn legal adult age, to do 2 years of military service. And a lot of countries do that. But Israel forces them to sign up for military service. That is indentured slavery. Whether you want to or not, you have to do it.
To their pharaoh, who was considered a living god. The pyramid.
So they feed you, they house you, they bathe you, they take care of you, they give you money, but you have to.
Pyramid builders were paid in food, beer, and the promise of a blessed afterlife, not driven by the crack of a whip. History is often more nuanced than Hollywood would have.
So they willingly went into these Corvier agreements because they believed that their afterlife would be better if they served this purpose. So this was not entirely forced the way the story was told.
Have us believe. This Hollywood
was the saddest.
This Hollywood myth has been
so learning how, so the matrix angle, learning how ancient powers organized labor and leveraged status differences shows how belief systems can justify exploitation without clear evidence. So we've had this entire belief system put on us without very clear evidence of this being an ethnically based hatred for them. We hate you. You will serve us. We are more superior than you. It is turning out to be that was likely not the case. So now we're going to move into a deeper area of discussion called the Hyksos and the collective cultural memory. So the Hyksos. What is the Hyksos? In the second intermediary period, so circa 1650 to 1550 BCE, so a period of 100 years, a Semitic group known as the Hyksos ruled parts of Egypt. So that time frame is really important because this would be during the time that they claimed. Well, let's just go ahead and watch lay video on this.
Did you know that for about 100 years, Egypt was ruled by a mysterious group of foreigners known as the Hyksos? Well, in today's video, we will find out who exactly were the Hyksos and how they managed to rule over Egypt. So without any further ado, let's get started. The Hyksos were an ancient people who lived in the eastern Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age. Their origin is debated among historians, but it is generally believed that they came from what is now Syria or Palestine. What we know about the Hyksos comes mainly from Egyptian sources, which often portray them as a foreign threat to the Egyptian way of life. However, recent research suggests that the Hyksos were not a monolithic group, but rather a collection of different peoples who were united under a common name by the Egyptians. The Hyksos first appeared in Egypt in the 17th century BC during the reign of the 13th dynasty. At this time, Egypt was divided into two separate kingdoms, with the Hyksos ruling in the north and the Egyptians in the south. The Hyksos quickly made their presence felt as they began to expand their territory into the Nile Delta and Upper Egypt. They also introduced new military technologies to Egypt, such as the horse-drawn chariot. This gave them a significant advantage over the Egyptians, who relied primarily on foot soldiers. Despite their military prowess, the Hyksos were eventually driven out of Egypt by the Egyptians. However, they would not be gone for long, as they would return in the 16th century BC during the reign of the 15th dynasty. This time, they would rule over all of Egypt from their capital at Abris. Despite being outsiders, the Hyksos were surprisingly successful in ruling.
So this would be like during Altair in, Assassin's Creed, Desmond.
Over Egypt. They were able to maintain order and stability throughout the kingdom, and they were also able to build impressive monuments such as the Temple of Ammon at Karnak. However, their rule was not without its problems. The Hyksos were constantly at war with the Hittites to the north and the Assyrians to the east. In addition, they faced several revolts from the Egyptians who were unhappy with their rule. Eventually, the Egyptians were able to unite and drive the Hyksos out of their country once again. After their expulsion from Egypt, the Hyksos would go on to establish kingdoms in other parts of the Middle East, such as Canaan and Mesopotamia. But that would be a story for another day. So what do you think about the Hyksos? Let us...
All right, so the Hyksos were foreign rulers, not slaves, and ruled Egypt for a century before being expelled by native Egyptian dynasties. So this was like during the same time that they say, that the Hebrew slaves exist. Some scholars suggest that later generations reinterpreted memories of foreign rule and expulsion as the story of Israelite bondage and liberation. All right, so now we are ready to get on to another YouTube video.
What is your personal opinion on Abraham's existence? Do you think he's probably a fictional, mythological origin character in a way? I mean,
yes, I would agree with that. He is.
What is your personal opinion on Abraham's existence? Do you think he's probably a fictional, mythological origin character in a way? I mean,
yes, I would agree with that. He is an important figure in theology, but he is at the time in history.
Why Abraham's important, why they're bringing up Abraham. Abraham would be the father of Israel.
I think the biblical writers knew very little about. It's the language of Genesis is what is referred to as standard biblical Hebrew. That is, it was the language of about the 8th century. It doesn't reflect the Hebrew that would have been around in the time of probably of David. Certainly not in the time of Abraham. It wouldn't have been understood. The archaeology of those sites doesn't match in existence at that time.
we are Myth Vision. Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Today, I have a special guest. Actually, I don't know if any of you know who the gentleman is, but I'm going to introduce him here. And it is Dr. Lester L. Graby, and that is probably the anglicized version.
Are works that I've personally written. Several of them you mentioned
Origins of Israel maybe might be an interesting discussion as well. We could start as far back as we can and then work our way.
As I try to survey that area, the area of Canaan, Palestine, and ask, where did Israel originate? What information do we have? Can we find evidence for its origins? And basically, it's going over material. A lot of it is material that specialists will be aware of, so it's not that new in that sense. But it was trying to ask, have we overlooked anything? It's interesting you mentioned Aaron Meir. He's an archaeologist, and I know him and respect his work, and I think he and I would agree on a lot of things. And of course, his specialty is the Philistines. He's been excavating a site in Israel for the last, I don't know, 15 years, which is quite an important
linguistic pronunciation.
But I would agree that there is a long history. And what we find is in the second millennium, that is from about 2000 to 1000 before the Common Era.
The Philistines came from the area of Philippi.
We find various groups of people in, all over the ancient Near East. We have the Assyrians, the Babylonians, which everyone has heard of. We have a group called the Arameans. They come along later, closer to 1000, but they are perhaps more closely related to Israel. They spoke a language, Aramaic, which eventually Jews...
which is why the Passion of the Christ is entirely in Aramaic, almost.
Many Jews spoke, and actually became language that was spoken widely in the Babylonian area. They, of course, originally spoke Babylonian and continued to use the Babylonian language, which was written in cuneiform script. But when we start looking for Israel, I was wondering, do we see anything relating to Israel elsewhere in the ancient Near East? And I really couldn't find a lot. But in the biblical text, of course, you have the idea that Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees. Chaldee is another term relating to Mesopotamia. But actually Chaldean the Chaldeans don't come along until later, quite about 1,000 years after Abraham is alleged to have existed.
Mm-hmm.
So that is an 1,500 years before that.
Right.
And they remember, or they envisage a character who did certain things and so on. But when we start asking, did he actually exist? It's very difficult to know. We simply don't have any direct information. And when we look at the tradition about Abraham, we find anachronisms in it that suggest that at least parts of it were written down or were learned or were developed later on and reflect a different background from the one that would have been there around 2000 before the Common Era.
Do you happen to have a date you would put on when?
This man, Lester Graby, is a retired American scholar and emeritus professor of Hebrew Bible and early Judaism at the University of Hull in England.
You think this, if I could use the word narrative, because whether there was a guy or not, what we have is a story. Do you happen to put a date potentially of, we know Assyria and Babylon are playing a role in the 8th century, 7th century BC, especially right. Assyria, they were the major players. But when do you think Abraham's story developed in Israel?
I think the story as we have it probably came along about that time. Now, how much earlier material they had, I don't know. But as it was passed down, it was shaped and developed. And the language it's in, for instance, the language of Genesis is what is referred to as Standard Biblical Hebrew. That is, it was the language of about the 8th century. And it doesn't reflect a Hebrew that would have been around even in the time of David. Certainly not in the time of Abraham. It wouldn't have been understood. Mm-hmm. So occasionally hear about one or two cities that in the very far north of Canaan. But anyway, in the Egyptian records, we know about groups of people. And they're given names that we're to some extent guessing what they are, but there's fairly general consensus among Egyptologists of people who came into Canaan from, or Canaanites who went into Egypt or were in contact with Egyptians. And then Egypt, starting from about 1800, before the Common Era, they actually take over Canaan. So they, or at least they have incursions into there to steal riches and make slaves. And in some cases they fight against the Canaanites, and others they have the overwhelming force. But from these we know about Egyptian contact with the Canaanites and with Canaan, and they name cities. Sometimes they're names that we don't find, in the biblical text. In other cases, their names are close enough that we can say, oh, well, this is probably such and such a place. For instance, the city of Megiddo in northern Canaan, south of the Sea of Galilee, is quite an important name that comes up in a lot in the Egyptian records, because the Egyptians besieged it several times. They took it, and there were fights around there and so on. But what we find is that there were apparently people brought in from Canaan who seem to have been, some cases they were slaves and so on. And then there were others who were, seemed to be migratory groups that would come to Canaan, bring their livestock, especially in times of drought. They were coming looking for food, for water. And so we know something about the group. Devastated indicate it's been speculated that they were in their, if it's a people, they have a little different determinative, and it looks like it refers to Israel as a people. And it's generally agreed this is how it's written. Of course, in Egyptian, Israel is written not straightforwardly as Israel, but it's close enough that generally people identify it as Israel. A few want to say it's something else, but most say it's Israel. So we first have reference to Israel, but some have said, this is about the time of the Exodus, and therefore this may have something to do with it. But Merneptah says he defeated them. In fact, he says he destroyed them.
Right.
So how does this have anything to do with an Exodus from Egypt? Mm-hmm. When we look at Egyptian history, we don't find any time when some group devastated by plagues and various things Egypt and then left.
Right.
With a high hand, taking several million people and cattle and so on. If we want to argue for an Exodus, we can't find anything like an Exodus in the Bible. Some have said, well, it's maybe a small group left, escaped slaves who were, maybe it was a regiment or something of the army was sent after them and got overwhelmed by in Pithom, which are mentioned as storehouses that the Israelites built. Did they exist at that time? Well, I think with Pithom, I think it did exist in the what is called the New Kingdom period. Depends on when some put the Exodus, 200 or 300 years apart from others. So exactly when you'd want to put it would be a question. But Pithom, I think, did exist. But Ramses is a name that it's found on several places and so on, as well as being the name of a king, of several kings. Actually, there's up to Ramses VI, I think. But the way it's written, at least it's been argued by Egyptologists, the way it's written is a later form of the writing of the name rather than is found in the biblical text compared with Egyptian. Now, when you're comparing Hebrew and Egyptian, of course, it gets technical. And of course, different scholars will debate this and so on. But from what I understand from Egyptologists,
Okay, so that's just another source explaining what we just went over. So, this is exactly how myths form. You have to have collective memory plus political narrative plus sacred storytelling that becomes a foundation for identity and theology. So let's get into the Exodus story as a mythologized history. So what is an Exodus? An Exodus is a mass departure or emigration of a large group of people from a place, often to escape a hostile environment or to seek better conditions. It originates from the Greek word exodos, which means road out. It refers generally to a withdrawal or a retreat. So let's look at a biblical short, explaining the Exodus. I thought it was
The book of Exodus. It's the second book of the Bible, and it picks up.
I wrote in my notes that it was a short, and it is not a short. It's in regular format. So here's a better screen for you.
The book of Exodus. It's the second book of the Bible, and it picks up the storyline from the previous book, Genesis, which ended with Abraham's grandson, Jacob, leading his large family of 70 people down to Egypt. Now, Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, had been elevated to second in command over Egypt, and he had saved his whole family in a famine. And so Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, offered the family to come live there.
So don't forget, with everything we just learned about Abraham, the Bible claims that Jesus came off the bloodline of Abraham.
As a safe haven. And so eventually Jacob dies there in Egypt, and Joseph and all his brothers do too. About 400 years pass, and the story of the Exodus begins. Now that name refers to the event that takes place in the first half of the book, Israel's exodus from Egypt. But the book has a second half that takes place at the foot of Mount Sinai. In this video, we'll just focus on the first half, where centuries have passed, and the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied, and they filled the land. Now, this line is a deliberate echo back to the blessing that God gave all humanity back in the Garden of Eden. And it reminds us of the big biblical story so far. Humanity forfeited God's blessing through sin and rebellion, and so God chose Abraham's family as the vehicle through which he would restore his blessing to all the world. But the new Pharaoh does not view Israel as a blessing. He actually thinks this growing Israelite immigrant group is a threat to his power. And so just as in Genesis, humanity rebels against God's blessing, so here, Pharaoh attempts to destroy the source of God's blessing, the Israelites. He brutally enslaves them in forced labor, and then he orders that all the Israelite boys be drowned in the Nile River. Now, Pharaoh, he is the worst character in the Bible so far. His kingdom epitomizes humanity's rebellion against God. Pharaoh has so redefined good and evil according to his own interests that even the murder of innocent...
Which this narrative right here in and of itself, if you remember from last week when we talked about Egypt was not the type of culture to ask, did you obey? They asked, did you walk in truth? So how could that philosophy, if that's their cultural philosophy, how could this atrocity come out of that type of philosophy?
Children has become good to him. And so Egypt has become worse than Babylon from the book of Genesis. And so now Israel cries out for help against this new Babylon, and God responds. God first turns Pharaoh's evil upside down as an Israelite mother throws her boy into the Nile River, but in a basket. And so he floats safely right down into Pharaoh's own family. He's named Moses, and he grows up to eventually become the man that...
Which is not a Semitic name, or it's not a name, that's an Egyptian name. There was a Pharaoh before him with the name Moses as part of his name. Can't remember. We talked about it earlier.
That God will use to defeat Pharaoh's evil. In the famous story of the burning bush, God appears to Moses and commissions him to go to Pharaoh and order him to release the Israelites. And God says that he knows Pharaoh will resist, and so he will bring his judgment on Egypt in the form of plagues. Then God also says that
And remember, there's no evidence of any of those plagues. No historical documents, no diaries, no nothing. Doesn't mean it didn't exist, but we just haven't found it.
He will harden Pharaoh's heart. And so we're introduced into the next main part of the story, the confrontation between God and Pharaoh. Now, what does this mean that God says he'll harden Pharaoh's heart? It's super important to read this section of the story really closely and in sequence. In Moses and Pharaoh's first encounter, we're told simply that Pharaoh's heart grew hard. There's no implication that God did anything. And so in response, God sends the first set of 5 plagues, each one confronting Pharaoh and one of his Egyptian gods. And each time, Moses offers a chance for Pharaoh to humble himself and to let the Israelites go. But after each plague, we're told that Pharaoh either hardened his heart or that his heart grew hard. He's doing this of his own will. And so eventually, it's with the second set of 5 plagues that we begin to hear how God hardened Pharaoh's heart.
So the point of the story seems to be this. Even though God knew that Pharaoh would resist his will, God still offered him all of these chances to do the right thing. But eventually, Pharaoh's evil reaches a point of no return. I mean, even his own advisors think that he has lost his mind. And it's at that point that God takes over and bends Pharaoh's evil towards his own redemptive purposes. God lures Pharaoh into his own destruction as he saves his people, which is what happens next. With the final plague, it's the night of Passover, and God turns the tables on Pharaoh. Just as he killed the sons of the Israelites, so God will kill the firstborn in Egypt with a final plague. But unlike Pharaoh, God provides a means of escape through the blood of the Lamb. And here the story stops and introduces us in detail to the annual Israelite ritual of Passover. On the night before Israel left Egypt, they sacrificed a young, spotless lamb and painted its blood on the doorframe of their house. And when the divine plague came over Egypt, the houses covered with the blood of the lamb were passed over, and the son spared. And so every year since, the Israelites have reenacted that night to remember and to celebrate God's justice and his mercy. But Pharaoh, because of his pride and rebellion, he loses his own son, and he's compelled to finally let the Israelites go free. And so the Israelite slaves make their exodus from Egypt. But no sooner do they leave that Pharaoh changes his mind, and he gathers his army and chases after the Israelites for a final showdown. As the Israelites pass through the waters of the sea safely, Pharaoh charges towards his own destruction. The Exodus story concludes with the first song of praise in the Bible. It's called the Song of the Sea. And the final line declares that the Lord reigns as king. And then the song retells in poetry what the story of God's kingdom is all about. It's about how God is on a mission to confront evil in his world and to redeem those who are enslaved to evil. God is going to bring his people into the promised land where his divine presence will live among them. This story is what it looks like when God becomes king over his people. So after the Israelites sing their song, the story takes a sharp turn. The Israelites, they're trekking through the wilderness on their way to Mount Sinai, and they're hungry, they're thirsty, and they start criticizing Moses and God for even rescuing them. They say they long for the good old days in Egypt. I mean, it's crazy. So God graciously provides food and water for Israel in the wilderness, but these stories, they cast a dark shadow. And we begin to wonder, could it be that Israel's heart is just as hard as Pharaoh's? We shall see. But for now,
all right. So most historians see the Exodus narrative as a mythologized memory, not literal historical fact. The story likely grew over time as oral tradition to explain identity, deliverance, promised land, and divine relationships. But there's no Egyptian text that records the plagues, the mass enslavement, or the departure of a large Hebrew population, notable because Egyptian admins were incredibly meticulous. So you would think you would find something somewhere with everything that we do have. All right, so let's go to a short that I have for you.
If you are talking about a biblical literalist exodus, if you are, I mean, just in pure plain sense of the text.
Really good critical thinking questions. Get past her liberal appearance. We already know that every professor is taught by a liberal university. So let's just get past that.
Text. Then the answer is no. The idea that hundreds of thousands, millions of people could have left Egypt in one event, basically in a single night, and, then spent the next 40 years traveling together as an organized group, eventually invading Canaan again.
Thomas, this is what I have to say. Here's the thing. These lives are just people getting to join me live real time, because I would have put out a recorded episode anyway. If live wasn't a thing, I'd be putting out recorded episodes like old school days, like podcasts. But live just lets you watch me do it in real time, and then it just gets posted later. So it's just more fun. You know what I'm saying? It's just more fun. But let's get back to it.
And all at one sort of single historical moment is not supported by the evidence, nor is the idea, and this is even more important, I think, to get right up front, that there was a people.
Hold on.
If you are talking about a biblical literalist exodus, if you are, I mean, just in the pure plain sense of the text, then the answer is no. The idea that hundreds of thousands, millions of people could have left Egypt in one event.
Just think of 100,000. Do you think about bad weather in your state? Like, I don't know. Thomas is in Anchorage, so he doesn't really deal with like congestion like we do in the lower 48. But I'll say this. I've been in, like, there's no way 100,000 people are moving all in one night, especially all at the same time, especially on horse. No way.
Basically in a single night. And, then spent the next 40 years traveling together as an organized group, eventually invading Canaan. Again, all at one sort of single historical moment, is not supported by the evidence, nor is the idea, and this is even more important, I think, to get right up front, that there was a people resident in Egypt who would have thought of themselves as a unified people, called themselves Israelites even, right? Because by the time the Israelites are in Egypt in the Bible, they are Israelites, right? Their patriarch is called Israel. There's no evidence for that either.
So there's a brave soul who's willing to go against the mainstream and be like, y'all, we don't have any proof of that. Besides, common sense. How could they? Now, the parting of the Red Sea has been proven to be a real thing because there's a downward wind that comes seasonally onto the mountain ridge, onto the ocean right there, the sea, and splits open the water and exposes a mountain ridge line, a top line, ridge line that they could cross. But that happening all in one night, common sense tells you that's like highly unlikely. So the Matrix angle is that religion often transforms real history into mythology for social cohesion. Why do you want social cohesion? It creates powerful, emotionally when there's cohesion, it's easier to control everybody. Oh, my cousins, brothers, sisters are doing this, well, then that's what I'm going to do too. It creates powerful, emotionally resonant stories that are not literally true. That's what religion does. It has a goal of social cohesion. So next video coming up is going to be this one.
The Exodus, a pivotal story in the Bible. But does history support this epic tale? Some scholars argue there's no substantial evidence for the mass migration described in the Bible, suggesting it might be a mythological narrative. Controversially, others claim it reflects a memory of a real historical event, possibly a smaller scale migration or political upheaval. Examine the evidence and explore the debates surrounding the historical accuracy of the Exodus. Is the Exodus a historical fact or a symbolic myth? Subscribe to explore more historical controversies.
Now we have this one.
The Exodus, a pivotal story in the Bible. But does history support this epic tale? Some scholars argue there's no substantial evidence for the mass migration.
Could the biblical Exodus story have royal roots? Some historians suggest a fascinating link between Moses and Pharaoh Akhenaten. Around 1350 BCE, Akhenaten introduced monotheism to Egypt, worshipping a single god named Aten. Strikingly, this aligns with Moses' portrayal as a proponent of monotheism within the Hebrew Bible. The theory suggests Moses might have been a high-ranking priest or even a member of the royal family involved in Akhenaten's religious revolution.
Which is much
After
more accurate.
Akhenaten's reign ended and his monotheistic ideas were suppressed, Moses could have led his followers out of Egypt, forming the basis for the Exodus narrative. While not universally accepted, this intriguing hypothesis highlights the potential for historical overlaps between the Egyptian royal court and the biblical text, offering a new perspective on ancient religious transformations. Could the biblical Exodus story have royal roots? Some historians suggest a fascinating link between Moses and Pharaoh Akhenaten. Around 1350 BCE.
Yes, Thomas, understanding the topography definitely helps with this narrative, because once you start understanding like where these lands were located and the time, so the location and the times, according to archaeological digs, don't line up with the way it's described in the Bible. So small group, the key points going forward. So on the actual relationship between Egypt and early Hebrew groups, small groups of Canaanite and Semitic peoples lived in Egypt, some as laborers, some as settlers, but not a dominant enslaved nation. The Merneptah stele, it's, like a cuneiform but on steel, mentions Israel in Canaan, not in Egypt, and that was circa 1208 BCE. That indicates that by this time, Israelites were already a distinct people outside of Egyptian control. Some historians view the sojourn in Egypt as economic migration, seasonal work, or localized labor agreements rather than forced bondage. And again, that goes back to the egyptimmigration.org website. Now, I've got some interesting videos to show you. This person, I can't remember if he's like pro-typical narrative that we all know, or if he was more along the lines of exploring the inconsistencies, but here we go nonetheless.
One of the interesting things that they've discovered, there's an old ancient papyrus that actually predates the 18th dynasty, that dates like 100 or 200 years before this, that shows that under the slavery of the Hyksos, they did enslave Semitic peoples, Hebrew peoples. In fact, in this papyrus, it shows a registry of 77 slaves that this one particular owner had purchased. And out of the 77 slaves, 48 of them were Semitic names, meaning they had Hebrew or Canaanite origins from that land. And one of them was actually named Shiphrah, which is interesting because in the Hebrew, the Exodus narrative, one of the midwives' names.
Shiphrah. So there was Sephra, Moses' wife. Now there's another name that keeps coming up, Shiphrah.
Was Shiphrah, which means we see that that was actually a common name among the Hebrews that were enslaved there. One of the interesting things that...
Okay. And then the next video.
One of the claims that you'll hear from skeptics and scholars even is that the Hebrews, there's no evidence that they were in Egypt. Well, Harvard actually did a study where they went around to the 7 major different Jewish groups around the world. And they did, like you can do the 23andMe or Ancestry.com and you get your DNA tested. Well, when they did that with these different Jewish groups, one of the things that they found is prior to the diaspora, where the Babylonians...
The Jewish people Israel as a country doesn't allow any of its citizens to do DNA tests. That's why I played this video. I meant to tell you that before.
Conquered the Jews and scattered them all over the world. So 586 BC, before that, so we're talking ancient times, there was a significant contribution of African DNA into the Jewish lines. So in the report, they say the Jewish groups descend from a common ancestral...
And remember, Jacob, the tribe of Jacob, was marrying into Egypt. So
population, which was itself admixed with Africans prior to the beginning of the Jewish diaspora that occurred in the 8th to 6th century BC. So yes, they were in Africa.
Boom. Okay, so they were marrying before all of this. The Hebrews and the Egyptians were mixing.
So the irony is you have the Hebrew that reduces Egypt into slavery, and generations go by. Pharaoh has all the power, and eventually
said you have the Hebrews who reduced Egypt into slavery. You heard that right.
Turns and bites the Hebrews, and then they're going to be enslaved because they're growing so numerous. The Egyptians fear them, and they say, we need to put taskmasters over them. And so what they started, growing this government to be wildly big, turns on them, and they end up getting enslaved, and they're going to be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. So the irony...
So just understanding these nuances pulls you out of the binary, like, oppressor victim narrative and more into complex historical reality. That's going to come in handy for us later. So why does myth matter? Why spiritually and psychologically does it matter? Let's play this video for you.
What are the main psychological interpretations of myths? Imagine stories that have traveled through thousands of years, shaping cultures and beliefs. But what if these ancient tales also reveal something about our minds? That's what psychological interpretations of myths try to uncover. Myths are more than just stories. They are symbolic maps of human inner life. Psychologists see them as expressions of universal patterns that everyone shares deep inside. One of the earliest and most influential thinkers in this area was Carl Gustav.
So let's just pause and read the slide. Myths are stories that have traveled through thousands of years, shaping cultures and beliefs. They are symbolic maps of human inner life, revealing psychological patterns. And Carl Jung believed myths, who is German, by the way, believes myths reflect archetypes like the hero, shadow, and mother, which are universal symbols in our collective unconsciousness. Now, I love Carl Jung. When I studied him during university, studying to be a psychologist, whereas Sigmund Freud, the Jewish person, I found to be incredibly deviant and very much in the darker, more masculine areas of psychology, whereas Carl Jung was more in the light side, the feminine, the divine feminine, the more nurturing umbrella.
Jung. He believed myths reflected archetypes, basic symbols and themes that are part of our collective unconscious. These archetypes include the hero, the shadow, and the mother. They show up again and again in stories from all over the world because they represent...
So Carl Jung, that's how you say it in German, Carl Jung, saw myths as a bridge between conscious thought and hidden parts of the mind, helping us understand ourselves better. Myths can be viewed as ancient therapy sessions, externalizing personal struggles and growth. Stories of heroes facing trials mirror our own life challenges and inner journeys.
Presenting core parts of human experience. Jung thought that myths act as a bridge between our conscious thoughts and the hidden parts of our mind. They help us understand ourselves better by externalizing our inner conflicts and desires. Think of myths as ancient therapy sessions, where stories symbolize personal struggles and growth. For example, a hero facing trials in a myth mirrors our own challenges in life. When we see these stories, we can interpret them as guides for our own inner journeys. Some scholars see myths as collective dreams, shared mental pictures that express common worries like mortality, identity, or the search for meaning. These stories help communities make sense of confusing or frightening events by turning them into memorable tales. Others analyze myth characters as representations of mental health traits or disorders. For instance, certain mythic figures might embody narcissism or trauma, giving us clues about how ancient...
It's a lot like DC Comics. They're very much a dark psychological comic book company, and most of their villains and heroes are actually representing certain health traits, disorders, and personality types.
People understood mental states. Myths also serve social functions by passing down values, morals, and explanations for natural phenomena. They shape how individuals see themselves and their place in the world. Today, understanding myths through psychology can be a tool for self-reflection. Recognizing archetypes or themes in stories helps us see our own conflicts and growth areas more clearly. So, myths are not just old tales. They are psychological mirrors that connect us to the universal human mind and our shared cultural history. In essence, the main ways to interpret myths psychologically are as symbols of universal patterns, as ancient forms of therapy, as collective dreams, as reflections of mental traits, and as cultural stories shaping our inner worlds. These ideas show how myths continue to influence us, revealing the timeless connection between stories and the human psyche.
And our next video
mythology.
Before I get into that, so the Exodus story became a foundational myth, and it's shaped identity, divine purpose, and liberation theology for later communities. What are we talking about? We are talking about what is happening now today. Liberation. This is the foundational story as to why Israel is constantly going to war with their cousins in the Middle East, because of that foundation myth that they have, that they are now forcing upon Americans as well to gain financial support for their endeavors. Let's move on to the next video. Ancient mythological creatures, legends, and origins.
Mythology is more than stories, it's the soul of cultures. Myths provide a sense of belonging and identity. Mythological tales address our deepest fears and desires. Mythology influences modern culture, art, and media. These myths shape our collective consciousness. Explore the power of myths with us. Subscribe for more. Mythology.
Myths and reality. What do legends hide? Are legends just fairy tales? Number. In reality, myths encode archetypes and life scenarios. This is the language of the soul, not facts. Roots in Jungian psychology, Carl Jung, and cultural anthropology. Research shows that mythological images awaken emotional memory and activate the same brain zones as personal experience.
That what he said right there is really important. Let me back that up.
The same brain zones as personal. Research shows that mythological images awaken emotional memory.
Mythological images awaken emotional memory
and activate the same brain zones as personal.
And basically tricks your brain into believing that you've had that same personal experience, which is why pornography can be so detrimental for people, because you are conditioning your brain as if you have experienced this already.
Personal experience. Myth isn't fiction, it's a mirror.
So pornography is a wonderful example to use in how something that can seem real is a total myth.
Remember your favorite myth or fairy tale. Ask yourself who you embody there now and write down what this archetype wants to tell you. More energy practices, spiritual insights, materials with us on Instagram and YouTube. Visit the profile, there's Instagram and YouTube. Subscribe, like, grow spiritually. Myth.
So if Christianity is taking over the world, right, and you do not want to be held accountable for murdering the world's Lord and Savior, well, you would have to come up with your own oppression victim story of like, but look, evil is on us too. Da, da, da. Like there's definitely motivations, but myths, they often serve as psychological and social functions, as we've been discussing, explaining suffering, promising redemption, legitimizing a person's place in the world. So you could definitely see why they would have their own agenda to, perpetuate this story.
Have you ever wondered why myths and legends captivate us? They're not just stories, they're reflections of our deepest fears and desires. Mythology reveals the human psyche, showcasing our struggles and triumphs. Take the hero's journey, for example. It mirrors our own paths to self-discovery. Legends teach us about morality, community, and the unknown. They help us make sense of the world, bridging the gap between reality and imagination. So next time you hear a myth, think about the psychological truths it holds. What do these stories say about us? Let's unravel the significance together.
Okay. So when myth is taken as literal history by institutions of power, it becomes a tool for control rather than a tool for insight, like what these last videos have just explained.
A lot of people are struggling with the idea of religion or the idea of spirituality in general. And it may seem as if somebody who goes in and opens it up or cracks open the myth is going to make it less impactful. But my experience with Joseph Campbell is the opposite, where he's not discounting myths by revealing their underlying wisdom. He's not discounting the myth. He's actually making it more impactful, because it really does open you up to seeing the imagery or the symbols all around you. And Joseph Campbell does a great job of taking stories and making sure that we don't literalize them, but that we see kind of the psychological process that's going on behind the story. I think that's fantastic.
So I don't know who that guy is, but this man just had some key points in here that I wanted to talk about.
A lot of people are struggling with the idea of religion or the idea of spirituality in general. And it may seem as if somebody who goes in and opens it up or cracks open the myth is going to make it less impactful.
So this would be the cognitive dissonance that engages when you don't want to explore parts of the legend or myth that don't make sense. There's always going to be truth woven into every lie. That's how good lies are believable.
But my experience with Joseph Campbell is the opposite, where he's not discounting myths by revealing their underlying wisdom. He's not discounting the myth.
You can take what he's saying, you can take a bad thing and understand why it was used. You can take a good thing and understand why it was used. What in this story can we find wisdom from? And that wisdom, the real wisdom of it, may not be the actual conclusions that the system wants you to come up with, which is, this is the reason why we have to baby Israel and give them everything they want. In fact, that wisdom could be the sheer opposite. Why should I give them my tax dollars? Why should I support them in war? When human life is being taken, we should question if we should support it. So understanding these myths and breaking them down and understanding the legend helps you answer questions like, should I be okay with this? Should I subscribe to the common belief? What wisdom is this going to reveal to me? Is this going to reveal wisdom of how mass amounts of people are able to be taken advantage of? Or is this going to be wisdom that reveals to me how not to become slaves or indentured servants? Or is this going to be wisdom revealed to me that powerful entities can control a narrative for hundreds and hundreds of years, an entire era? So we have to start to question, what's the difference between a sacred myth and a historical reality? Is there a difference? Truth doesn't weaken your spiritual identity. And I think that's what Charlie Kirk did a good job showing, because truth can only strengthen your identity. So let's go. And I'm not talking about this phrase that the woke left likes to use, your truth. your truth implies that that phrase implies whether it's true for everyone else or not, you need to accept this because it's my truth. And there's a collective consciousness, and then there's your own individual consciousness. And that violates the collective consciousness. So real truth, the truth that's in the collective space, knowing that actually helps you with your self-worth and self-identity.
Throughout history, two forces have shaped civilizations, sacred beliefs and political power. But what happens when they collide? Sacred beliefs anchor identity and morality. Political power builds nations and enforces order. But when these ideologies clash, the stakes are monumental.
So when these myths, these ideologies, look at what he just said last.
Political power builds nations and enforces order. But when
Builds nations and enforces order. So what is Israel doing right now? Look at what they're doing. They're trying to enforce themselves as the order in the Middle East.
these ideologies clash, the stakes are monumental. Take the Protestant Reformation. A monk's spiritual critique ignited a political earthquake, or the French Revolution, where secular ideals toppled divine monarchy. Today, the fight continues. From LGBTQ+ rights to Sharia law debates, ideology fuels policy and division. This isn't just history, it's about your future. Which ideas will dominate? How do we balance faith and freedom? Subscribe to Ideology Unleashed. Dive deeper. Question everything. Smash the like button. Share your take in the comments.
Some people wrap up their whole purpose or identity in something. And then when that identity is challenged, they lose it. They lose their minds. Why? Because their world is crumbling. Their God is dying. People don't like when you challenge their God. Some people wrap up their whole purpose or identity in something. And then when that identity is challenged, they lose it. They lose their minds. Why? Because their world is crumbling. Their God is dying.
Right.
People don't like when you challenge their God. Some people wrap up their whole purpose or identity in something. And then when that identity is challenged, they lose it. They lose their minds. Why? Because their world is crumbling. Their God is dying. People don't like when you challenge their God. Some people wrap up their whole purpose.
True. God is truth. Whoops. So, to escape the matrix, we must decode the stories we were taught and reclaim our ancestral past from mythic control narratives by getting closer to God, by seeking truth. Seeking truth means you're seeking the kingdom of God. So let's go on to the next one.
The closer you get to Jesus, the more sensitive you become to the darkness of sin. The more you surrender to God, the more you allow Him to develop your character, the more sensitive you become to wrongdoing. Whereas maybe you used to do certain things, go certain places, say certain phrases, use certain words, but now that you're drawing closer to God through surrender, now that you're yielding more of yourself to Him, those things grieve your heart. This is why I say that often this mourning over sin isn't a sign that God is rejecting you or putting you at a distance. Rather, this mourning over your brokenness is a sign that you are indeed surrendering more of yourself to Him.
And the fact that you're watching this series is one of those signs that you are drawing closer to Him, because we are about exploring truth.
You were never meant to fit in. You were meant to stand out, in silence, in presence, in truth. Your stillness speaks louder than chaos. Your gaze, it pierces through the mask they wear. You don't chase the spotlight, but darkness still trembles when you enter, because you don't need to shout to awaken truth. You are the reminder, the mirror, the spark in the void. They feel it before you speak. You are not here to conform. You were never meant to fit in.
Just a little encouragement. If you're feeling like, whoa, I don't fit into this world. So we're going to summarize here the key takeaways. There's no historical or archaeological evidence supporting the biblical narrative of Hebrews enslaved in Egypt as a nation, or that there was a miraculous exodus where hundreds of thousands, if not millions, left in one night. There were Semitic people in Egypt, laborers, migrants, workers, and groups like the Hyksos, whose expulsion may have influenced later collective memory. And the Exodus story functioned as a mythologized identity and theology, not literal history. So there's no clear ancient evidence that the Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt, once again, as described in the book of Exodus, but there is also no evidence of a formal, benign, localized labor agreement. So this was just more of a custom involving a distinct Hebrew people as a group. What does exist is a much more complex, gray, and fascinating reality about labor, migration, debt, and myth-making in the ancient Near East. So to break it down cleanly, Egypt's labor system, what they actually did. Egypt did not operate on chattel slavery the way Rome or the transatlantic slave trade later did. Instead, Egypt used multiple labor systems. So Corvier labor, which was the most common. You know what? Let's just define Corvier labor really quick. I mean, why not? Just so we could see it with our own eyes. So Corvier labor is a system of unpaid, forced, and temporary labor imposed by rulers, states, or feudal lords upon citizens or peasants, typically used for public work, infrastructure projects, or agricultural tasks. It was a common form of a work tax in ancient civilizations, Egypt, Sumer, and China, and medieval Europe, and often required in lieu of monetary taxes. So that's a very broad-ish term. They use mandatory labor owed to the state, which was used for irrigation, temples, pyramids, especially Old and Middle Kingdom. Workers were paid in rations, so food and alcohol. They were housed. They were allowed to have families. And this applied to the Egyptians and the foreigners alike. Archaeology confirms that pyramid workers were not slaves. When it comes to debt bondage, people could be bound to labor due to debt. It was temporary and not hereditary. And that was common across Mesopotamia and Egypt. Captive labor, war captives could be forced into labor, but not just because you were born as a Hebrew in a Hebrew tribe. And when it comes to captive labor, this was more common in the New Kingdom period. And it still wasn't racialized. Lifelong slavery was later imagined. So to summarize who the Hebrews were historically, the term Hebrew, Abiru, appears in Egyptian, Akkadian, and Canaanite, Canaanite texts, and it refers to a stateless people, migrants, laborers, mercenaries, and outcasts. They were not an ethnic group, and they were not yet Israelites. So Hebrew, again, stateless people, migrants, laborers, mercenaries, outcasts. Many scholars believe that early Israelites emerged from within the land of Canaan, which is actually Gaza today, not in Egypt. So the migration into Egypt, what likely happened was that Egypt regularly accepted Semitic people from the land of Canaan. The famines drove migration. The Nile stability attracted the workers. And some examples of that were the Hyksos period, the Semitic rulers, when they actually enslaved Egypt first, and then the Asiatic workers in the Delta. So these groups worked agriculture, they served in military or construction, and were sometimes welcomed, sometimes resented. So you see both things, which is like just of normal life of people who come and go. They were liked and disliked. This fits the Genesis Joseph narrative much better than the Exodus slavery narrative. So to summarize the Exodus story, the history of the theological myth, there's a critical point for you guys here. The Exodus story functions as a theological origin myth. Okay. Hang on a second. My computer is bothering me. Where am I? Oh shit. Hold on. Okay. So the Exodus story functions as a theological origin myth, not as a historical record. Problems with the literal narrative. No archaeological evidence of 600,000. There's no evidence of 600,000 Hebrew men. There's no evidence of plagues, and there's no evidence of a mass escape. Also, just common sense tells you, how could that many people leave in one night? Egypt kept meticulous records, and this would have been noted somewhere. I mean, we have found so much information. We would have found something somewhere of a ethnic group being enslaved as a whole. And the Sinai shows no trace of 40 years of wandering. So it shows no beaten paths that were made by humans, no trade system. There's just nothing there to show around the Sinai that there was 40 years of wandering around the wilderness. Most modern historians see Exodus as a memory of smaller migrations combined with trauma narratives, identity formation, and political theology. So what was a labor contract? Which it's important to be precise here. There's no ancient text describing a formal labor contract between Egypt and the Hebrews as a people. But Semitic workers were employed. Some were bound by debt, state obligation, survival necessity. But there were also other Africans that were under the same sort of situations. The conditions could be harsh, and status can change over time. So the more accurate framing of this scenario would be that the Hebrews were not enslaved as described by Exodus, but neither were they simply volunteer contractors. They were part of a fluid labor class that was common to the ancient world. So if they're going to leave books of the Bible out, like the Book of Enoch or the Book of Mary, you have to question what they did leave in. Was it edited in any way? To summarize where the slavery narrative came from, this is where matrix programming actually enters. The Exodus story was written centuries later, so after the fact, during or after the Babylonian exile, which served to unite the tribal groups, establish Yahweh as the liberator, or Jehovah, define Israel against empire, and to create a moral authority. So religion wasn't used to control the Hebrews here. It was used to basically forge them. And it wasn't until later that Christianity universalized the narrative through different scholars who were Hebrew scholars that were experts in Jewish history and Jewish theology. Modern politics has weaponized it, and slavery metaphors basically became literalized. So the real takeaway is the truth that actually breaks the matrix. Ancient people did not think in modern categories. Identity was fluid. Myth was a tool of meaning, not deception, and power came from story, not chains. The danger isn't that religion lied. The danger is that we stopped understanding how myth works. So I'm going to show you a couple more videos to end with, to leave you off with just a little bit of inspiration. Hold on. No. All right. So just to fix my screen. Ta-da. She knows what she's doing.
There are 10 powerful psychology truths in life. 1. Silence is more powerful than trying to prove a point. 2. When trust is broken, sorry means nothing. 3. Control your actions. Learn to react less. 4. When you are honest, you lose people who don't deserve you. 5. One beautiful heart is worth more than 1,000 beautiful faces. 6. Small circle, private life, clear mind, happy heart. 7. Never go back to somebody who has already broken you. 8. Stop overthinking. You can't control everything. Just let it be. 9. If somebody is stupid enough to walk away from you, be smart enough to let them go. 10. True friends are very rare.
Yes.
If you have one, you're very lucky. If you made it this far, comment changed.
And the last video to leave you with some inspiration.
You can't break a person who's not afraid to eat alone, who's not afraid to be rejected, who's not afraid to lose friends in the process. Because that person, they've already faced the silence. They've already sat with loneliness. They've already learned how to clap for themselves. You can't bring down someone who stopped waiting for validation, who turned their pain into power, who turned their wounds into wisdom. That kind of person, they're held up by something stronger than applause. They're fueled by something so powerful called self-respect. And once you learn to stand on your own, they can try to push you, but you won't fall.
It's so funny that I brought up the DC thing. I kind of forgot I had this video in queue with the Joker. It's funny how, your brain works. All right. So, my friends, I'm going to close out. There is a cost to truth, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying or selling you something. Because when you choose to be a seeker, when you choose to ask questions instead of swallowing stories, you feel it first in your loneliness. Rooms get quieter. Invitations slow down. People you once laughed with start looking at you like you're dangerous. Not because you're wrong, but because you're no longer manageable. Truth has a way of stripping illusions, and most people are deeply in love with theirs. Here's the ancient wisdom they don't teach anymore. The path of truth has always been a solitary one. The prophets were lonely. The mystics were lonely. The watchers on the wall were lonely. Not abandoned, but set apart. Because when you stop outsourcing your discernment, you step out of the crowd and into the wilderness. And yes, the wilderness is quiet. But it's also where God speaks. Not through noise, not through consensus, and not through popularity, but through stillness. When you are a truth seeker, you will lose false friends, but you will gain clarity, and clarity is holy. God does not need a mob to affirm him. Truth does not need applause. And light doesn't ask permission to shine. So if standing in truth leaves you alone at times, understand this. You are not lonely. You are aligned. Because God has never been found in the center of a herd. He's found in the margins, in the questions, in the courage it takes to say, Something doesn't add up here. You don't need everyone to walk with you. You don't need everyone to understand you. And you don't even need to be liked. What you need to be is true. Because when you are true, you're never actually alone. Because God is closer to the seeker than to the comfortable. Let others chase approval. Let others chase belonging. Let others cling to myths that keep them safe but asleep. You were not born to be safe. You were born to be awake. So if the road narrows, if the crowd thins, if your circle gets smaller, stand tall. Because the soul that walks with truth walks with God. And that is the only companionship that has ever truly mattered. Seek truth, even if it costs you comfort. Even if it costs you friends. Because truth is never going to abandon you. And God never leaves those who dare to look him in the eye and say, I choose light, no matter the cost. That's how seekers survive. And that's how the world eventually changes. So with that, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I bid tonight. It's been a interesting one. But with that, I bid you adieu.